He slid the glossy binder across the desk and said, very softly, "You built this whole thing, right? Then you can explain it to my daughter." I held his stare and kept my voice level. "If you want me to teach someone to fly the plane at cruising altitude, Mr. Brandt, you should at least make sure she's been in a cockpit." He laughed like it was charming that I had a spine. Then he turned in his chair and gestured to the woman sitting on the leather sofa beneath the window, a woman who'd spent the last 10 minutes scrolling through her phone like the meeting bored her. "Nolan, this is Sloan. She's fresh off an MBA and looking to make her mark. I want her hands on operations by the end of the month. My name is Nolan Pierce. I'm 42 years old, and until that moment I was the lead database architect at Arcadia Ledger Systems and St. Louis, a financial data firm whose heartbeat ran through the architecture I wrote one midnight at a time for 12 straight years. Every pension remittance, every insurance payout, every compliance snapshot in our $900 million platform passed through code I knew like the grooves on my own palms. I'd slept on beanbags during upgrades, eaten cold pizza on raised server floor tiles while re-indexing under a deadline, and missed weddings to nurse needle-thin performance back to green when a regulator was peering over our shoulder. Now the owner wanted me to explain it to his daughter. Sloan uncrossed her legs, slipped her phone into a handbag the size of a carry-on, and sat up with a practiced smile. "I've been reading about AI and data lakes," she said. "We're behind the curve." I looked out at the winter sky beyond her. The glass made our 32nd floor view look like a screensaver. River gray, bridge steel, barges crawling. "We've been running ML-assisted optimization since the winter 2 years back," I said. "Saved $42 million in compute and storage last fiscal. The curve is where we put it." Her smile thinned. "Right." Grant Brandt, our founder and king, tugged the cuff of his shirt until the monogram winked. "Fresh eyes, Nolan. Fresh energy. She doesn't need to match you on nerdy specifics, just the big picture. You can do that." I could. That wasn't the point. The meeting broke. I walked the long corridor past the framed covers of trade magazines that had once called us revolutionary, past the awards for uptime and integrity, past the map dotted with client cities, Columbus, Tulsa, Little Rock, Omaha. My reflection ghosted across the glass as I moved. A tired man in a navy sweater, shoulders a little too tight, carrying a laptop whose stickers had peeled off years ago. Back in my office, I closed the door and brought up the system diagrams, the ones nobody else could read without me. Not because I hoarded knowledge, but because architecture is a quiet language you learn in the doing, in the choices you make at 4 in the morning when a single wrong key press can make auditors twitchy and clients furious. Arcadia Ledger's core wasn't just a database. It was a choreography. Data landed from 17 states' worth of feeder systems, got cleaned, normalized, versioned, encrypted, streamed to consumers in near real time, stamped with evidentiary hashes for regulators, and archived with retention logic that would make a librarian weep. There were redundancies braided inside redundancies. There were tests layered like wooden dowels in a boat hull. There were notes tucked in doc strings I'd left for a future me who might forget why June of that year needed the weird exception. And there was one other thing, a thing I'd never told another soul. It slept under 1,000 lines of innocuous safety code in a place I called the atrium. It did nothing all day for years. It simply watched for a particular kind of touch to the spine of the system, a root-level change made without the right signature. If it saw that touch and it didn't recognize the hand, it did what I had designed it to do during a government RFP season when paranoia felt like prudence. It pulled the firebrake. It protected the whole by burning the part. In plainer words, it wiped. You can't build that kind of device with malice. You can only build it with love of a system so complex and mission-critical that the worst sin isn't failure, it's compromise. A total wipe is survivable if your backups and replication authorities haven't been polluted. A compromise, a slow leak, a drift you don't notice until a regulator does, those are cancers. That was the calculus when I wrote the atrium. The rule was simple. If my biometric and my token didn't bless the deepest changes, the system would rather die on purpose than be twisted. I had planned to retire the atrium someday. Then December happened. 2 weeks after the Meet My Daughter meeting, a message hit my inbox at 8:47 a.m. Subject line: Organizational restructuring, confidential. The body was corporate oatmeal. We value your contributions, leadership changes, knowledge transfer. Please make yourself available. Sloan Brandt, 24, would be Chief Database Officer. I would transition to consulting support over 2 weeks, a timeline that suggested they thought you could microwave mastery. I didn't slam my fist or throw a mug. I sat very still and listened to the building breathe. Behind me, the server room hummed like a cat. In the upper right of my monitor, the system admin panel glowed. I opened it and saw that new credentials had been minted for Sloan, admin privileges. The atrium watched. It didn't blink. At lunch, I called my brother in Denver and told him I might be visiting sooner than planned. He laughed and swore and told me to get out if I had to. You'll be fine. You always land on your feet, he said. I said sure, but I didn't feel like I had feet anymore. I felt like a root ripped out of the ground. The knowledge transfer began on a Monday. I was in Conference B at 8:45 with handouts, an executive-grade overview, diagrams as simple as I could make them, a list of daily tasks that kept the core happy, a glossary that translated our technobabble into English. At 9:20, the glass door whispered open and Sloan arrived with a latte and a breeziness that clung to her like perfume. Sorry, traffic, she said, as if that cured the disrespect of stealing the minutes of a man who had given his life to this room. We started with what you'd give a bright intern. The platform ingests from these 17 feeder systems, I said, pointing. We run a transform layer that cleanses and normalizes. Then we fan out, traders, compliance, statements, analytics. Here's the security stack, encryption at rest and in motion, key rotation, hardware modules and cages. This is the legal retention logic. These are the night jobs. These are the real-time checks. This is the one that pings me if something truly weird happens. She nodded at random intervals like she was listening to a podcast on double speed. So, could we just throw this in the cloud? She asked, pen tapping a paper she hadn't read. We could do anything, I said. We shouldn't do that. Not without an 18-month regulatory process and a data residency plan signed in blood. The cloud won't save you from ignorance. She said, writing cloud? We broke for lunch. She took a call in the hallway about a bachelorette weekend in Miami and laughed in the direction of the glass. Through it I could see the atrium of the building, the Christmas tree, the concierge desk, the security guards. I felt like I was at the bottom of a swimming pool watching a party happen above me. In the afternoon, I tried another tack. I gave her a beeper duty list. If you get this alert, do this. If you see that error code, call me. If the compliance spool gets behind by more than 3 minutes, pause this and rerun that. Never touch this menu unless you know why you're touching it. And if anyone tells you to change security settings on the fly, you tell them no and send them to me. She smiled, wrote nothing, and asked what ingress meant. By Wednesday, Grant called me into his office and pitched it like I was the problem. She feels you're making it complicated on purpose, he said, hands tented. The system is complicated, I said. It's not a mood I'm projecting. It runs $2.6 billion a day through its hands. He rolled his chair back and let the silence sit there like an accusation. We need you to meet her where she is, he said finally. High level. Strategic. High level, I repeated, and went back to my office to write a document that had more white space than words. That night, I couldn't sleep. I put on my coat and drove downtown because sometimes the only thing that quieted me was standing in the server room at 2 in the morning listening to the minuscule sounds. Air through grills, fans ramping down. The small sigh a rack makes when it warms and cools. The building was empty. I waved at the security guard I knew by name. He waved back with pity he hadn't meant to show. I scanned my finger on the reader, stepped onto the raised floor, and opened a console window. My eyes went to the access logs out of habit. Something snagged my attention. There were entries at weird times, 1:42 a.m., 3:19 a.m., Sundays, holidays. The user was Paul Tiernan, our CIO. He had privileges, sure, but not these. He was peeking at bones he didn't understand. I followed the trail. It led to a hidden share in our executive file server, a place the engineers never visited because it was full of board decks and HR templates. Buried 5 folders deep under strategic planning was a presentation stamped 6 weeks old. Database operations transition, roadmap. My hand shook a little when I clicked. Slide 1. Thumbnails of our architecture with arrows and pastel boxes and buzzwords laid on like frosting. Slide 4. Knowledge extraction. Slide 9. Legacy system modernization, vendor shortlist. The logo in the corner belonged to a consultant called Quantic Edge, a name I'd heard in the kind of meetings you attend to nod and not be asked anything. Slide 12 made me laugh, which came out as a sound that made me glad no one was there to hear it. Estimated cost savings from personnel reduction, $182,000/annum. They had put a $sign on my name. Beyond that, it got meaner. Lower risk profile by reducing single points of failure. I was a single point. Retire legacy architecture and personnel. I was legacy. Transition to modern cloud-native approach under new leadership. I was being condensed to a bullet point under a banner. I printed the deck and slid it into my bag. I closed the share. I walked to the window and looked out over the icy river and tried to remember what it felt like to be trusted. The atrium breathed under the code like a big cat sleeping in tall grass. I met with Sloan again in Conference B because that's what loyalty looks like even when it feels unrequited. I reduced the story another layer. This is the lane. These are the guardrails. These are the 3 big levers you're allowed to touch. She drummed her nails on the table and broke my heart by saying, "Can we just put all the old stuff in cold storage so it doesn't slow us down?" Like archives weren't the legal backbone of our whole presence. In the hallway afterward, I ran into Raina, our night shift SRE, who'd been with me since the warehouse days. She stared at me over the rim of a paper cup. "They're doing you wrong," she said. "They're doing what they think the street wants," I said, because I couldn't bear to admit that they were doing me wrong to my face. "You gonna be okay?" "I am," I lied, and went to my office to clean the dust off the corners of my doc wiki, so the kid they'd thrown into the deep end wouldn't drown as fast. The farewell celebration invite landed in my inbox a week later with clip art confetti. 2 p.m. Friday. Cake in the break room. Remarks from leadership. The kind of event where people cluster around the carrot cake and say, "You'll be missed," without making eye contact because they're worried they'll be next. I RSVP'd, then closed the calendar and opened the atrium. The device didn't need me. It was as automatic as sunrise. It waited for a fingerprint and a FIDO token. It would accept no substitutes. I had always planned to sunset it. The moment never came. Friday morning, I stood in my closet long enough for my dog to wonder if I was okay. You don't pick a tie for war. You pick a tie to mark the last day of a life. I nodded the one my father gave me when I graduated Georgia Tech. He died 3 years ago. He told me to build things I could be proud of. I thought of his hands, which were nicked and scarred from engines, and wondered if he'd think what I was about to do qualified as pride. At 11:45, I went into the server room to do what I had done every morning for a decade. Check the health panels, read the overnight logs, murmur a silent thank you to the gods of electricity, air conditioning, and rate arrays for one more day without alarms. I placed my finger on the glass, watched the reader go from red to green, and did nothing else at all. I did not open the atrium. I did not turn the key that would have told it. If you see a stranger's hand at the root of me later today, please be merciful. I shut the door on the sleeping cat and left. At 2 o'clock, they gathered under fluorescent lights that made everybody look a little haunted. Grant spoke first and told a story about the early days that had the dates wrong. He talked about family and about the future because those are the 2 mythologies bosses reach for when they need to sell you something you don't want. Sloan went next and used the word blockchain 3 times in sentences that didn't need it. Paul said something about grit and excellence and handed me a plaque that would end up in a moving box I wouldn't open. I thanked them for the chance to build something. I thanked Raina by name because she had kept me sane in the dead hours, and I thanked the drivers who carted in new racks at midnight during that blizzard, and I thanked Ravi for writing the neatest tests I'd ever read. I did not thank Grant. Gratitude can be selective. By 4:30, my desk was down to its bones. I put 2 books in my bag, placed my nameplate in the trash, and stood in the doorway looking at the indentation my chair had left in the carpet. Sloan breezed in with her laptop open and the system console maximized, eyes bright, fingers hunting. "I'm going to tighten security," she said, like she was telling me she'd discovered penicillin. "We're pushing to production at 5. "Don't," I said, and then because pride goes down easier with a chaser, I added, "Without me here." "Thanks," she said, not hearing the second half, and clicked. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button like I was signing a document. I nodded at the security guard who had known me 12 years and said, "Take care, Tony." He wished me luck in a voice that recognized a man breaking up with a part of himself. By the time I hit Highway 40, the sun had dropped behind the roofs, and the sky was that brief bluish color that makes concrete seem sentimental. I unlocked my back door at 5:13. I let the dog out. I poured a beer and sat on the back steps. At 5:17, my phone vibrated the way a phone does when a human being on the other end is holding it like a life raft. "Paul." I declined. He called again. I answered. "Nolan." "Jesus. We've got." "Everything is," he swallowed. He wasn't a man who swallowed words often. He was a man who told other men what to do. "What happened?" I asked softly. "She changed a core policy in Auth," he said. "We saw the alert. Then the whole thing went dark. Not just the primary. The mirrors. The failovers." He took a breath and said a thing no CIO ever wants to say. "We can't see the backups." "Corruption?" I asked. "Everything reports as encrypted under an unknown authority," he said. "No keys match. Audit trails stop. The chain of custody logs are gone." Doesn't feel like the right word. His voice cracked on the last syllable. He knew what this meant to our clients and to him. "Have you called the bunker?" The bunker was what we called the offline vault we wrote to once a night by hand like monks transcribing a Bible. Everything else could fail. The bunker was supposed to be your last sacrament. "It won't mount." He was crying now, just a little. "Nolan, I need you." I set my beer down and let the foam settle. "I don't work there anymore," I said. "I'll get you a contract. Anything you want. Just come." I stood up and watched my dog sniff the grass with innocent devotion. I thought of the slide with the bullet point, "Retire legacy personnel." I thought of the word savings in the same sentence as my name. I thought of the 2 a.m. nights in the server room when I wrote the atrium because I loved what we were building and I didn't want anyone poisoning it for a bonus. "I can't sign my name to a fix, Paul," I said. "Not after today. I hope you understand." He didn't, or he did and hated me for it. He hung up without saying goodbye. At 6:04, Grant called. I didn't take it. At 6:21, my text messages ticked like hail. Raina, whose 2 words said everything. It triggered. A reporter from the Business Journal asking for comment. A compliance officer I knew from a regulator in Kansas City writing. "Is there anything we should know?" I put the phone face down and listened to the cicadas. By Sunday, the story had broken like a dam. Catastrophic data loss at Arcadia Ledger Systems, the paper said. 47 institutional clients affected. An anonymous source said architectural failure. Another said human error. No one said, "We tried to cut the throat of the man who knew which vein to touch." On Monday, the SEC and 2 state attorneys general announced inquiries. By Wednesday, the share price was a cliff. People like to say systems are fragile. They're not. They're resilient right up until the moment you teach them not to trust you. Then they protect themselves. I didn't gloat. Gloating is for people who win things on purpose. I mourned. I sat on my couch and remembered the faces of the first 10 people in the warehouse, the exact huff the radiator made, the pizza boxes, the day Raina and I realized our queue had hit 1 million messages and our little platform had become a city. I remembered the day my father visited and put his hand on a rack door like it was a horse he didn't want to startle. All this from the kid who used to take apart the VCR, he'd said. 2 weeks later, Arcadia filed for bankruptcy. I read about it on my phone in the aisle of a hardware store while buying a plunger. The line between the heroic and the ordinary is thinner than people pretend. Grant texted me then. "I wish we'd done this differently," he wrote. "Coffee." I typed and erased 3 answers, then turned the screen off. Sometimes mercy is silence. Sometimes it's a letter you never send. The first call that mattered came from Zurich. The second came from Luxembourg. The third came from a firm in Toronto that had been watching us since the magazine cover days. I didn't send a resume. I listened. 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Europe with a suitcase, a suit, and a folder that held a pen I liked. When the new chief risk officer extended his hand, he did it like a man who understood that code is a craft and that craftspeople don't bloom under disrespect. "Whatever else you ask of us," he said, "you'll never have to explain to a relative how to run your system." I laughed then, the kind of laugh that shakes dust off a soul. "That's all I require," I said. I rented an apartment with high windows and a view of a river that wasn't the Mississippi, but tried. I bought a bicycle and learned how to order bread in a language my mouth hadn't practiced since college. At night, I wrote documentation no board would ever call knowledge extraction. In the morning, I met with engineers who asked good questions and took bad ideas apart gently. A month into the new life, I woke at 3 with a dream about the server room, the hum, the green lights, the feeling that if I put my hand on the metal, I'd know the temperature just by the give. I made tea and sat on the floor and thought about Sloan. I didn't hate her. She was a symptom in kitten heel boots. If the atrium had triggered on a different hand, it would have protected just the same. A system doesn't know nepotism. It knows signatures. Raina emailed me from a personal account. Landed at a bank, she wrote. Middle of the night again, but people say please here. I wrote back, keep the lights on. She sent a photo from her porch of a St. Louis summer thunderhead the size of a country. 6 months later, I flew home for my niece's birthday and drove past the building I'd once lived in. The lobby lights were on, but the directory board had a new name. The old letters had been peeled, the ghost of their adhesive still visible in a way that would probably haunt me for a few more years. I parked 2 blocks away and watched people leave with gym bags across their shoulders and phones held between ear and shoulder, like life never stops talking to us. A man I recognized stepped out, Tony, the guard. He saw me and lifted a hand. I got out, and we met on the sidewalk like neighbors. You look good, he said. You look lighter. Sleeping helps, I said. They weren't fair to you. Maybe I wasn't fair to myself. He nodded like a man who'd heard too many versions of every story. You were always decent, he said. That counts. On my last night in town, I drove by my father's grave and read him a report he would have enjoyed. SLAs hit 99.99. Latency shaved a half a millisecond off at peak. Engineers who laugh with their throats, not their noses. A boss who uses we more than I. A dog who has learned to like rain. On the flight back, I thought about the atrium. About whether I would ever build something like it again. I thought about the ethics and the edge cases, about duty and harm. I don't know if I will. I know I won't build it out of spite. If I build a thing that burns, it'll be because the world sometimes asks you to choose the least terrible fire. 3 years passed. People stopped calling to ask what happened because they had their own fires. A trainee in my new shop pressed a question on a Tuesday. How do you know when to let go? I looked at her and realized she meant a job, a system, a plan, a grudge. When the thing you're holding would rather hold you back, I said. She nodded, wrote it down, and then did the thing that makes this craft worth it. She asked, how do you tell the difference? You listen, I said. Systems will tell you. So will people. So will your own ribs. That weekend I rode the bike along the river until my legs burned. I stopped on a bridge and watched the water. It had rained upstream, and the current looked busy with someone else's trouble. I thought of Grant's text. I thought of Sloane's pen tapping a blank sheet. I thought of Raina's thunderhead. I thought of my father's hand on the rack. When my phone buzzed, I let it buzz. The world can wait for you when you've spent long enough waiting for the world. In the end, there was no explosion, no lawsuit where I stood and said, you did me wrong, and a jury clapped. There was no parade either. There was just an ordinary day that turned into another one. A man who built a system and then built a life after the people he'd built it for forgot what it was worth. I carry a small scar on my right index finger from a server rail that bit me in 2013. It catches on fabric sometimes. When it does, I look down and remember the hum, the green lights, the cold air. I remember what it feels like to be necessary and what it feels like to be replaced. I remember that the two aren't opposites. They're neighbors. If you asked me now what I'm proudest of, I'd tell you it's not the atrium, though it did what I asked of it. It's not the patents or the magazine covers or the fact that I can still read a hex dump like a novel. I'm proud that when they slid the binder across the desk and said, teach my daughter the thing you made, and the soft voice in me said, you don't matter, another voice woke up that said, you do. Systems are honest. They do exactly what you tell them to do. People are messier. Sometimes you have to write a little device for your own heart that triggers when someone touches your root without your permission and says, gently but firmly, no. I built one. It took longer than 12 years, and no one congratulated me at a cake. But it keeps me safe. It lets me sleep, and it doesn't need my finger on the glass to know my signature.